more traditional religions, spirit religions that were prevalent in that area as well. And as Paul began to proclaim the gospel and the people began to see the power of the gospel demonstrated in some of the events that took place, they turned from their false gods to the living God and became believers. And they went out and burned their books, some 50,000 denarii worth of 50,000 days' wages worth of books, a lot of material. It reminded me of a situation that I was in Nigeria one time when the pastor of the church that we were members of came to see us. It was a big church. We had, on any given Sunday, 800 or 900 people in that church, always worshiped for 3 or 4 hours. And one afternoon, pastor came to get me, and he said, we've got a little something we need to do. He said, this young man that I've been witnessing to for some years has finally accepted Christ, but he's been involved deeply in some of the traditional religion things, and he's got all of these fetishes and all of these juju kinds of things in his house, and he wants to know what we should do with them. He said, I told him we're going to burn them. So he said, I want to do this publicly, so I'm gathering up everybody that I can gather that will come. And so we went back to the church, and on the church grounds, we dug a hole, we put all of his stuff in it, and set it on fire, and burned it. When people leave those religions, it's a drastic change. And I'm not sure the pastor wasn't just a tad afraid of some of those things. There's some holdovers of some of that stuff sometimes. And he wanted me there for some additional backbone. It was a very wonderful time to see this young man come out of that darkness. And you can't imagine how dark the darkness can be sometimes. There are sections not far from where we were living there where people are still eating parts of other people, killing people for their blood, killing people for their hearts, eating their hearts. A lot of people think, oh, that's the 1800s, but it's still going on today in some parts of the world. Ephesus may not have been quite like that, but it was a bad place in terms of the true understanding of God. And many of those Ephesians were coming to Christ, and Paul had a wonderful ministry there. He goes on to talk about, Luke goes on to tell us about all of the wonderful things that Paul did there. He preached and taught every day. And Paul himself says in this farewell address, I've now taught to you the whole counsel of God. It says verse 27, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole counsel of God. Now, I don't know any pastor that can say that. Paul was fortunate, didn't have the New Testament, I guess. He was busy writing parts of it. But he didn't have the New Testament. But even to try to preach to the Old Testament is a task beyond description. But Paul, in those 3 years that he was in Ephesus, day after day would share with the people. They didn't just meet on Sundays, they met often, probably every day, at least some of them, and he would share the whole counsel of God with them. So it was a wonderful time, and a time in which he developed very close relationships with those people. You can go back and read the book of Ephesians and see some and get another sense of the feel that Paul had for the Ephesian people, and he seemed to love them deeply. And so the response was great. He warned them too that when he left, savage wolves would arise in the middle of the congregation, in the midst of the congregation. It's always something that bothers you, I think, when you realize that almost all of the great opposition to the church doesn't come from outside, doesn't come from Islam, although that's bad enough. I almost preached on Islam today. I've been preaching about Islam a number of places because of the great threat that it is, but it's a threat. But the great threats to the church, the ones that are most damaging, most destructive, most breaking of fellowship have occurred from within. And Paul warns them that that might well happen again after they're gone. He says, savage wolves will arise. They're going to look like sheep, but they're going to be wolves underneath. And so that's part of the reason that Paul prays and offers this farewell blessing to the church. And listen to what he says again. And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace. 2 points, really. I commend you to God. The great leader, the great preacher, the founder of the church is leaving. And you can just imagine, now these were the elders that he was talking to. These were men that he'd been teaching and working with for years. But sort of like Jeff this morning, he said, well, if I make a mistake, just correct me. Just help me out. If I say something wrong, you correct me. Well, I wasn't about to do that. Jeff, I told you that. I wasn't going to do that. But and I didn't see you make any really big mistakes. Just low. But you can imagine when Paul is leaving, here's the apostle to the Gentiles, this great preacher with all of this knowledge and with all of this background is about to leave. And they're saying, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do now? I mean, who's going to preach for us and who's going to teach and who's going to do all the things that need to be done? Who's going to take care of the widows? And who knows how many other things that they had to take care of. And who's going to do it now? Guess what? They're going to do it. There comes a time, every place, everywhere, missionary leaves, pastor leaves, it says, okay, it's up to you. When my wife and I left Ghana, we kind of left under a cloud, sort of. The convention there had gone very, very charismatic, Pentecostal, and demon exorcism had become a really big thing. I mean, really big. And I was the principal of the college, the seminary there, and they wanted me to teach or to allow it to be taught that Christians can be demonized to the extent that they need an exorcism, just like an unbeliever might need an exorcism. I have no problem with, and I dealt with people that were demonized a couple of times. I have no problem with unbelievers, but I don't believe that you can find anywhere in Scripture, and I kept saying this to them, find me a place in Scripture where Paul's solution to a moral problem with a Christian is to have an exorcism. Find me one. Or any other of the apostles. Find me one. They couldn't find one, but that didn't make any difference. They believed what they believed, and they believed what they wanted to believe, and so they were getting really, really big on that. And my wife and I just felt like we couldn't continue. I could not allow that. I would not teach that, and I didn't want it to be taught where I was responsible for what was being taught either. It was a difficult time, and we left because of that. I just couldn't do it. So Paul commends them to God. And when I was leaving Ghana, we'd had a wonderful time there too, and it was time to leave. And we had prayed several times that, God, if you have another service for us somewhere else, we're willing. But it took a while before God really released us from our ministry there. And he did finally release us from it. And it was difficult. And now I commend you to God. Who's going to take over? Who's going to take your place? Had pastors come to me time after time that I had trained. I'd trained virtually, helped to train virtually all the pastors in Ghana at that time. It was a very young convention, and I'd helped work with them and had many, many of them come to me and say, well, who's going to stand up for these truths that you've been standing up for in our convention? A number of things, but who's going to stand up for those? I said, you are. You are, or nobody is. It's time for you guys to stand up. You've been trained. You know what the Bible teaches. You can read the Word. You can study the Word. It's time for you to stand up and do your thing. God's going to raise up some of you to be spokesmen, so do it. When Paul commends them to God, he's not just leaving them helpless. What more do you need than God himself to be with you? Yeah, you don't have a shepherd right now, and you're in the process of today or recent past beginning a process of looking for a pastor, but you've got God with you. If you're a believer, you've got the Spirit of God living in you. And God's with you. Now, while that may be some problems for some of you, and there's things you're going to have to do that you're not real comfortable doing. Jeff, I think you demonstrated some of that this morning. I don't know if I made you uncomfortable or what, but you were uncomfortable with that a little bit, I could tell. But so what? God's going to raise some of you up to do things that you never thought you could do when the time comes. So Paul commends them to God. He's not indispensable. Nobody is indispensable. Nobody at all. Do you know if I went back to that seminary where I spent 6 years in Nigeria at Ogbomoso, do you know if I went back there today, there might be one or two people who would know me. Not a single student would know me now. Not one. Not a single. Probably people probably have a hard time recognizing. I got grayer and a little heavier since I came home, and probably wouldn't recognize me at all. And